church. It's good to see everybody here this morning. Good to see a lot of faces that I don't know. I always enjoy seeing people that aren't usually here, and we hope that you know you are our honored guests, not just visitors. Come back anytime. We are always happy to have you be a part with us. This morning we're going to be talking about a subject that sometimes we don't necessarily like to talk about, but sometimes we need to. And it's also the next thing in line to talk about as we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. We've been talking about righteousness. We've been talking about the teachings that Jesus has given, and we've been talking about how we're supposed to be better than the righteousness of even the Pharisees and scribes, the religious leaders of that time. We have to be better than they were if we want to get into heaven. Well, this conversation continues, and we could even say that it is part of last week's lesson as far as an area of righteousness goes, and that is the area of making judgments. Let me turn this on, that would help. Making judgments. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6 this morning. You know, I don't know how many of you have come across people, or maybe even people in your own family, or maybe you're the one who did it. And you come into a room and you catch somebody like this with their back turned, and then they look at you and they see you eating cookies. You don't judge me. I can eat these cookies if I want to. That might sound silly, but the idea is there. You know, this passage that we're looking at in Matthew chapter 7, when you look at the very first verse, this is actually one of the verses that is really loved and quoted by people who don't want you to make any judgments about their life and don't feel you have the right to make any judgments. And so we're going to explore that idea this morning. We're going to look at this verse, and we're going to find out exactly what it's talking about here, what we're really trying to get at. One of the things we definitely want to understand, and one of the things that we should understand when we're talking about this judgment, whether you're judging or not judging, is the Greek word behind it. And it means to condemn or to judge as guilty. So, I mean, it is a literal death sentence kind of judgment you're making. You are condemning somebody for what they're doing. That's a pretty powerful judgment that you're making. And that's why this is a serious thing to talk about. If you're going to feel the need or the desire to judge someone for something they're doing, you might want to think very hard about it. But that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, because this is a phrase that's thrown around a lot. Don't judge me. You're going to get judged. Don't judge me. That kind of thing. So the question is for us this morning, is this true? Is this what Jesus was trying to get at? Is this what he really meant with this teaching? So we're going to dive into that, and we're not going to have a normal point 1, point 2, point 3. We're going to look at this with a logical progression. We're going to try to look at it with some critical thinking as far as what this is talking about and what the Bible says. And we're going to try to take a peek into the mindset of Christ, into the actual teaching of what's going on here. Now, a point I want to make that we need to remember, and this is going to play all the way through the lesson this morning, all the way to the end, is that there's two aspects of judging, and two specifically that are talked about here. By the way you judge, and by the standard or measure that you use. I want you to remember those two things, because they're going to play all throughout the lesson, and they're important to remember. So let's dive into it. The first thing we want to look at, or that we want to think about, is this idea, never judge. Is that really what it means? Well, if you think about it logically here, I want to throw out some just logical statements and see how this plays up. If all judgment is condemned, if we're not allowed to judge at all, that means no criticism of any kind is allowed. None whatsoever. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. Well, if you say someone is sinning in their life, guess what that means? You have criticized them for not being perfect. You have called out something they have done. So that means if no judgment is allowed whatsoever, that means we have no right to call anything sin. And even on a what should be a more positive note, that means even constructive criticism, things that are, again, supposed to be good, something that's supposed to be helpful, you can't do that either. Because even though you might have something good, you can tell them on how they could be better. Well, if you think they can be better, what does that mean you did? That means you judge them as not being perfect already. So logically, we have a little bit of issue here, and we can keep going with these. If all judgment is condemned, guess what? No church discipline is possible. You can't do it. Because if church discipline is something you want to do, it means you have to exercise judgment as far as the state that others are in, both spiritually and morally. If they have to be disciplined, so to speak, or if they need to be taught what was right, or if they need to be restored to the church, none of that is even needed or done if you cannot make a judgment. Church discipline just wouldn't be allowed if all you look at is verse 1 of chapter 7. And then you look at one more. It says, if all judgment is condemned, that means no false teaching could ever be exposed. How can you call something false teaching? And I love the fact that Ricky read the passage he did this morning talking about false prophets. How can we ever expose all the false prophets or all the false teaching that is out in the world, or even in our church, or whatever you want to say? How can you call anything false if you're not willing to make a judgment and say that it's not perfect? It's not what God taught. It's not what Jesus taught. The truth is it requires, again, to make a judgment in order to consider whether someone is teaching wrong or right. Whether they're in error or not, you have to make that judgment. And so if you're only going to look at verse 1 of chapter 7, it would mean that we can't call out anything that might be considered false. I hope you kind of are with me as to how this would play out. And the thing is I could go on and on and on about just about any topic you want. And the reason I chose these three is just because some of the passages I'm about to throw out there and how they connect to these topics. But I could use just about any topic I want to use. So when you're talking about never judging, there's some things that we need to consider. Did Jesus ever criticize? What was the first question? Criticism wasn't allowed. What have we been talking about pretty much since the beginning of Matthew chapter 5? Guess what? The scribes and Pharisees weren't perfect. Is that Jesus criticizing them? Criticizing the way they were living their lives? Not doing it perfectly? I think so. What about church discipline? Well, just later on in Matthew chapter 8, a passage I'm going to show you here in a little bit, Jesus talks himself about church discipline. Not Paul, not any of the apostles. Jesus himself makes some statements about church discipline, about going to your brother, correcting them, or helping them get right if they're sinning in their life. Jesus taught about church discipline too, and the necessity of it. Or what about calling out false teachers? Again, what has he been doing to these poor Pharisees and scribes? They were not living their lives in the way God had asked them to. Obviously, they were not living up to the standard that they were supposed to. But Jesus has called them out for teaching incorrectly. They were trying to force Old Testament law and Old Testament, you could even say, traditions, their own traditions onto people. They were teaching falsely. And Jesus called it out. Sounds like Jesus made some judgments. But he said, do not judge, lest you be judged. How does that make sense? We have to look at it logically here. So let's consider some passages. Look at John chapter 7. It says, do not judge according, this is Jesus again, do not judge according to the appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. This is probably the key passage for you to remember. For anybody who ever wants to say, oh, don't judge me, you don't have the right to judge me. Right here, both of those words in green, I put them in green because they are imperative words in the Greek. That means they are commands given by God, given by Christ himself. He says, do not judge. So we're commanded, don't judge. But look at how he emphasizes it. According to appearance. What do you think that the Pharisees and the scribes were constantly at fault for doing? They were constantly putting themselves in the position of being a judge over these people, putting themselves in a position of looking down on them because they weren't as good as them, maybe based on their outward appearance. Why do you think Jesus needs to teach this lesson? But then he says, but judge with righteous judgment. Judge with righteous judgment. So he's telling us not to judge. But he also, in the same sentence, he says, but judge. So it's not about that we're never supposed to be making a judgment, but it's about the fact that we are supposed to make a righteous judgment. That's what we want to focus on whenever we're going to make any kind of judgments in our life, is they need to be righteous judgments. Not just judgments of our own understanding or anything like that. Righteous judgment means that you are making a judgment based on what God has judged. We don't have a right to judge on our own. We can only judge based on what God has taught. After that, then we're just as bad as the Pharisees and scribes if we want to judge anybody outside of what God has judged. If you want to do that, then you might be taking a measure upon yourself that you don't want later down the road. Look again at another passage. A good tree cannot produce bad fruits, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits. This passage is talking, this is the passage in, I forgot what it was. I apologize. This passage is in Matthew chapter 7. This is actually in the same context. This is just a little later in the context that we're talking about in Matthew chapter 7. This is talking about false teachers specifically. And so Jesus himself continues on in this context, and he says, you're going to know false teachers by their fruits. You're going to be able to judge them based on what they do, what they teach. Are they teaching along the lines of what God says? Are they producing fruit for God? Or are they trying to produce some kind of evil fruit that is not in league with what God has taught? You will know them based on what they're doing. You will be able to judge who is who by those things. You can also look at Galatians chapter 6. It says, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you will not be tempted. How are you supposed to restore one unless you make a judgment that they are not living the way they should? Judgments are going to be made. And judgments have to be made at times. I'm not saying we should be judging everybody and we should be judging everything. But the fact is, the Bible teaches that we are to make righteous judgments. And we have to make judgments so that we understand what is right, what is wrong. How can you even understand something as simple as right and wrong if you aren't allowed to make a judgment as to what is right and what is wrong? Continuing on, this is that passage in Matthew a little later that I was telling you about church discipline. It says, if your brother sins, go to show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. It goes on to say, if he doesn't listen, then take 2 or 3. If he doesn't listen still, then it progresses and progresses until it finally says, you take it before the whole church. But the point being, what I highlighted there is to show him his fault in private. How can you say he has a fault if you haven't seen or made a judgment based on what he's doing, how he's living? And in the end, as the song that Jack sang for us is key, it's all out of love. We aren't making judgments, and we are not supposed to be making judgments that aren't based in love. We care about them. We want their soul to be safe with God. That is why we go and try to help restore one who is lost. That is why we go and show a brother a fault. But we're gonna look at this passage in Matthew 7 and clarify a little bit about some of this as well. Because we also see passages like this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 from Paul, where he says, therefore do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praises will come to him from God. Part of the point of this passage that I wanted to add in here is the fact that in the end, we have to be careful with our judgment simply because we don't know the intentions or the heart of the people we're looking at. Only God has that ability. We have to do our best to make decisions and to do things based on what God has taught. But, you know, there's going to be times where we need to reserve judgment and not try to make a judgment because we don't truly know the heart of the person we're talking to. We don't know the intentions, and sometimes we need to leave it to God to make the judgments in the end. Let's even consider the context we're talking about in Matthew chapter 7, even without jumping to other passages or other areas of the Bible. In Matthew chapter 7, the very end of the section we're looking at in verse 6, it talks about not giving the pearls to the dogs or the swine, not giving up the good things. How are you supposed to know what is a dog or what is a swine without making a judgment as to who the false teachers are? Who the people that aren't deserving of it are? Or later on, when we were talking about that passage that we just read about determining false teachers, he talks about the idea of knowing them by their fruits. Even in the very context that we're looking at, Jesus helps explain what he's talking about. It's not that we are never allowed to judge, but it's that our judgments need to be righteous judgments. They need to be in line with the judgments that God has made, not with judgments we want to make just because we want to make them. And it better not be based on what people look like on the outside. Because it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't even matter what you look like. You are a child of God the same way. You are created from him the same way. And he loves you, and we ought to love you the same way. We don't judge for those kind of reasons. The only judgments we can make are that is what is right based on what God says, and what is wrong based on what God says. Never based on what we want to say or what we think. Because in the end, and this is part of the key that I want us to emphasize, why even though we are allowed to make judgments that are righteous judgment, we need to remember that there's only one true judge in the end. And he's going to judge us too. And so we got to watch out for how we make judgments. It says in James chapter 4, it says there's only one lawgiver and one judge, and the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Judgments are going to happen. Judgments happen every day in life. We make judgments every day in life. But the measure and the standard of which you judge by, be careful. Because it's going to be measured against you. And that's part of the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach. Because we've seen over and over again that the Pharisees were lacking in righteousness. They were lacking in what they needed to be as Christians. And they were constantly treating people as lower than them and all those kind of things. And this is continued in this teaching here throughout this idea of making judgments. The Pharisees and scribes would put themselves up above everybody else, thinking they were better than everybody else. And this is Jesus' way of saying, hey, be careful the way you judge, because it's going to get judged against you. If you're going to make judgments, they better be righteous judgments. So let's actually take a look at what Jesus does condemn. He actually does condemn judgments to some degree in this passage, and we want to read that. But we're going to express or explain exactly what he's talking about. So we're going to read quickly as far as judgments being, one of the ones condemned being that it's blind to your own faults, potentially. We're going to read Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. It says, "Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So one of the things that we know that Jesus is condemning here is that we can't be making judgments when we're so focused on somebody else that we completely forget to examine ourselves. You know, we're not perfect. Nobody in here is perfect. We make mistakes too. So before you go and run around and start making major judgments against people, you better make sure that you're right with God. Otherwise, that judgment might come back to haunt you. You got to be careful with the judgments that you make. Because the other side of that is that we need to understand that we're going to be judged the way that we judge. You know, we've been talking about the Pharisees. We've been talking about the issues that they've been dealing with, and the fact that it's pretty easy to see based on chapter 5, verse 20, that they were lacking in righteousness. You know, we were supposed to be better than they were. They're lacking in a way where they don't understand what proper judgment is. They're judging people, not realizing that they're not living right in their own lives. And that is what is condemned. We can't be making judgments if we're not living right with God. We need to make sure that we're right with God before we ever want to make a judgment on anything else or anyone else. And above all, we need to make sure that our judgments are only based on God's standard and not on our own. So what measure or what way do you want to be judged? How do you want that judgment for yourself? Are you going to be like the Pharisees and you're going to make judgments based on what you believe or based on what you think is right or proper whatever it might be? Or are you going to be someone like Christ, or maybe like the apostles, or the way we should be, and make righteous judgments based on what God has taught? Only judging when something is truly wrong based because God said, don't do this, it's wrong. Those kind of things. Righteous judgment in the end is the goal. That is really what we want to be doing. That is what we are supposed to be striving for. It means that we judge only by the standard of which God uses. If God calls something sin, it's okay for us to call it sin. That's not our judgment, that's God's judgment. That's what He said. Whether somebody wants to say you're judging them or not, the fact is God said it was wrong. There's nothing wrong with us repeating God's statement. It also means if you're going to judge with righteousness, it means you're going to examine yourself first. Before you go running around or attacking people for the little issues that they have in their lives, because trust me, we all have little issues. You better make sure that you don't have a log sticking out of your own. You better make sure that you don't have something major going on in your own life that you are ignoring or not paying attention to. Sometimes you have to worry about yourself. Make sure you're right with God if you ever want to properly take care of the other people around you. You know, it's true that as leaders of the congregation, the elders and myself, we want to look after all of you. We want to make sure you're all right with God. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to take time to make sure we're living right ourselves. To make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Acting the way we're supposed to be acting. So what can we conclude from all this? What is really the key to pull from this passage on judgments, on somebody who comes up and says to you, don't judge me? Well, the truth is, if we simply call out sin for what it is, if we say anything is sin based on what God has said is sin, we're making a judgment. There's nothing we can do to stop that judgment from happening. God has called something sin. That means if you are actively engaged in it, or you have done it in your past, that was sin. That judgment has been made. Let's use, for example, lying. That's something that, a lot of people like to say white lies or whatever. Sometimes people think, oh, it's just a little lie. It's not a real big, so it's not really a big sin. It's a small sin. Well, all sin is sin. But the fact is, lying is something probably everybody in this room, whether you did it a long time ago or maybe you've done it more recently, it's something we've probably all done at some point in time, just to save our own skin or to not hurt somebody's feelings, not thinking about the detriment to ourselves when we do lie. But we don't always think about it. There's a passage in Revelation that says, no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever enter or come into it. He's talking about the New Jerusalem, talking about heaven. You can understand when he uses a word like abomination, that sounds pretty bad. But then he adds it, and lying. That's a judgment that's made by God. If you're engaged in lying, it is a sin. It is something you're not supposed to be doing. And it's not so much that I'm trying to judge you for what you're doing, but that is a judgment that God has made. I simply use that as an example of the fact that judgments are going to be made. But we need to make sure the judgments we make are in line with what God has said. I can say from this passage, and I can say from plenty of others, lying and other sins are a sin. Whether you're engaged in it or not. It is a sin. It's not because I want to judge you for it. It's because that's what God has said. I can make that decision based on that. So we need to understand exactly what truly making a judgment means, or making a decision means like that. So let's get back to those two keys of righteous judgment that we started off with. The first was by the way you judge. So this means examining yourself first in the way that you judge other people. If you're going to judge other people, you better make sure that you have looked at yourself, that you have made sure that you are right with God before you try to force anything on anyone else. Because you got to be careful about that. And it means not focusing so much on other people's faults that you aren't seeing your own. You need to be able to see people with love and with a righteous heart, caring about them in a way where you just want to help them to be right with God. So we have to be willing to examine ourselves, and we have to be able to show love and mercy. You know, again, the song that Jack sang, and I think he might have another one coming, talking about love one another. You know, don't let it be with angry words. We need to make sure that when we talk to our brothers, maybe that when there is a sin in their life, that we don't go against them with a judging attitude. That could be a problem too. Just because God has called something a sin and maybe somebody is engaged in it, does not mean you should be attacking them. They are still someone you are supposed to love. And in the end, someone that you need to show mercy on. If you want mercy given back to you. Because, and the reason I brought up the passage in 1 Corinthians, we don't know the intentions of their heart. And if you back up in the context in that passage in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says, if I have a sin in my life that I don't know about, how am I supposed to know? God will judge when the time comes. And then he gives that phrasing that I read to you. There's going to be times where we need to be careful what we do. We need to show love and mercy on some of those kind of things because we don't really know the heart or the intentions of some people. So we have to be careful how we show judgment upon them. We need to show mercy and love in any judgment that we make. The other part is by the standard that we use in our judgments. This is the measure that God has given. So this is the standard of standing up for what God determines to be right and standing against what God has said to be wrong. This doesn't mean that we are making a judgment on our own accord. I think that's the key here to remember when it comes to making judgments. Don't make a judgment based on what you think or what you believe. All of our judgments should be based on what God has taught us to know is right and wrong. That is the only place we have a right to stand on. And if you try to stand anywhere else, guess what? That standard is going to be used against you. When the day comes that the one true judge looks at you and said, I have to use the measure that you used. I have to use the standard that you used. If you weren't going to show love, if you aren't going to show mercy, how can I give you love? How can I give you mercy? We have to make sure that we understand that. And the other part of this, as I've already said, is the fact that we don't make judgments outside of what God's word has already said. That's something we need to be very careful of. And I know that the Bible doesn't give a do this, don't do this on every little thing. But there's going to be times where we need to just remain silent, not make a judgment, and let God be the one that judges in the end. All of this to say, I wanted to get through simply as a conversation to help us understand that judgments are going to be made in our lives. We're going to make judgments sometimes even when we don't realize that we need to or when we're going to. But if we are going to make judgments about anything, especially when you're talking about souls, people who are living their lives maybe to the best of their ability, if you are going to make that judgment, you better make sure that you are right with God before you go making those judgments. And if you're going to make those judgments, make sure you make them with love, with mercy. Because you need to make sure that if you're going to try to help your brother get right with God, it's because you love them. You care about them. Not just because you're wanting to point out, as the Pharisees often were said to be doing, that you just want to show everybody that you're better. Because I guarantee you, if you're trying to show everyone you're better, you're probably not the better one. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would probably agree with that. We need to make sure that we measure against God's standards. We need to make sure that we are using His teachings when it comes to making judgments in our lives, because judgments are going to have to happen. You know, we live in a world that's getting farther and farther away from God and saying that more and more is okay. But as you can see, even something as small, or what people like to call as small as lying, something that almost everybody does and doesn't think a second thought about. God said that's not right. How can we say it is? How can we agree that it is? But we need to be able to make those judgments in a righteous way, and we need to be able to do it according to the standard that God has used, not according to our own standard, not according to what we desire or what we want to say is right or wrong, but what God has said is right or wrong. I hope this morning that has been helpful for you in understanding this passage a little better. Maybe it'll help you not be the person who says, don't judge me all the time when moments like that come. I hope it'll give you a better understanding of what Jesus was trying to get at with this passage, what he was trying to teach us, his disciples, all those who are going to read this after the fact. I hope that it'll help you to make better judgments in your life based on what God has taught. Not just judging against other people, but making judgments against yourself. That's what self-examination is. It's looking at the measure God has given, and you judge yourself upon it. Do I measure up? Am I living the way that I should? Well, this morning, if you're not living according to God's standard, change that. Don't live in a way that is against God, because that is not a judgment you want to face when the time comes. I hope this morning you will be willing to come forward, to turn your life around, or maybe to start living your life for God if you never have. But if you have any need at all, I hope that you will stand as together we sing.
Jesus, the loving shepherd, calleth me now.